We really need to get to the root cause of why people feel like they need to blame specific subgroups, whether it's based on race, Black or Asian, Latino, based on gender, blame things on women, or, sexuality.
You're listening to Peachtree Corners Life, a weekly online radio show sharing ideas, opinions, and news about the city of Peachtree Corners. Now, your host, Rico Figliolini.
Hi, this is Rico Figliolini, host of Peachtree Corners Life in the city of Peachtree Corners. We have a special show today. I want to be able to talk about some of the things that are affecting recently a lot of the communities that surround us and that are with us. But first, before we get to that, I just want to introduce our sponsor for not only this podcast, but our family of podcasts, and that's Hargrave Fiber. They're a local southern regional company that provides internet connectivity and business solutions to an array of businesses, whether you're small or enterprise size. They've been working through the pandemic, providing coverage and internet connectivity to not only employees in the office environment, but also the home remote employee, and making sure that that's a seamless process. So check them out. They've been a great supporter of our podcast and our family podcast. So hargravefiber.com or hargrave.com/business. Now that we've talked about that, let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today, and I'm going to introduce our guests here. But today we're going to be talking about and putting a spotlight on crimes against Asian Americans, vicious crimes, attacks, harassment, crimes that have targeted a group that in the Atlantic, a recent Atlantic magazine article noted, while simultaneously stereotyped as model minorities and perpetual foreigners. They've had a history in America, both working over the past 100, 200 years, providing growth in this country, and been an important asset to this country, I believe, an important community member to this country. But hate incidences targeting Asian Americans have risen. And in 2020, it was over 150% before previous period of time. So, and Asian American women have been targeted twice as likely in these attacks, according to recent data. So, without further ado, let's introduce Long Tran, owner of Peachy Corners Cafe. Welcome, Long. Appreciate you coming on the show with me.
Thanks, Rico. Honored to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I thought it was long overdue to get this discussion going. So, I know you're a Peachy Corners business owner with Peachy Corners Cafe, great new place that a lot of people are discovering and going to. But you live in Dunwoody also, and you've been involved recently, as I've known, through protests as well. So give us a bit of introduction about yourself.
Sure. As you said, I've lived in Dunwoody, next door to Peachy Corners for about 10 years now, and I'm very involved in the city of Dunwoody. I lead a Cub Scout pack, and I'm currently serving on an economic recovery advisory council to the city of Dunwoody. And so we're hoping to, bring back some businesses and get some new business startups. So I'm really involved. But when the shooting happened in Atlanta, from customers to friends and family who called me, a lot of people were upset. And so I reached out to many of the Asian organizations that I support that have been advocating for the Asian community for decades now. And we all wanted to do something. And there were 3 nursing students who specifically, they wanted to take charge and lead the effort. And so they coordinated with me, and we did something down at the State House that, by our estimates, probably 3,000 people showed up. It was something that's never happened in Georgia to have that kind of protest coming from the Asian American community. It was very peaceful. We had all kinds of elected officials come out. Senator Ossoff and Senator Warnock came out, and even Governor Kemp came out against what happened, came out against the shooting. So to bring this awareness and get the media coverage and actually feel the emotion beyond our community, the Asian American community, and see the support from the Jewish community who's gone through something like this with the synagogue shootings, or the Black community with the church shootings. And then, of course, the white community has reached out and expressed their shock and disbelief because of the model minority myth. You don't realize the type of discrimination Asians go through.
I think part of it, like we discussed beforehand a few days ago, is that particularly in the South, we're both from the North, right?
Yeah.
But particularly in the South, Asian Americans tend to be more quiet, less wanting to make waves, be under the radar. How is it that you found yourself speaking up? Why did you choose to do that?
So for me, I feel like I've been speaking up for quite a while now. I like to go back to 1995, but I grew up with a slightly different perspective. In the early 80s, there was the war between South Vietnamese refugees and the KKK down in the Mississippi Delta, Biloxi. The white fishermen did not appreciate that there were Vietnamese fishermen after the Vietnam War, and they didn't like the competition. And so they call it a war broke out down there where people were killed on both sides. And so living up north, we were always afraid, would that come up north? And so my dad would have discussions with his family and friends that were Vietnamese, like, what are we going to do if the KKK comes for us? And so it's always been there. And then Vincent Chin was a catalyst for the Asian American community when he was killed by two guys who thought he was Japanese. And this was during the anti-Japanese automaker sentiment in the 80s. And the judge said, well, these are two good guys and their lives shouldn't be thrown away. So all they had to do was pay a $3,000 fine. And a $3,000 fine was all you needed to get away with murder. And so it started with me at a young age that this had to be addressed. And so when I got to college, I became much more active in speaking up when things would happen, especially to students who were getting bullied on campus or hazed differently from their other roommates or colleagues when they would rush for a fraternity. And so I've been speaking out for quite a while, but right now it seems like I'm given a stage to amplify my voice far more.
How did you hear about the spa shootings? How did that make you feel when you heard that?
So I woke up and usually I don't turn off my phone, but for whatever reason that night I had turned off my phone so I could just get a good night's sleep. And I woke up, I turned on my phone and it just blew up with all kinds of text messages or Facebook messages with people asking me if I knew about the shooting, what's going on, And so I turned to the news and sure enough, that night there was the spa shootings and I was angry because, we've known this was coming for a while. Last summer in July, I believe it was July, there's a Chinatown in Chambly-Doraville and white supremacist protesters showed up armed with guns and they harassed business owners and their patrons. They didn't stay very long and they got scared off as soon as the police were called, but it was a sign of intimidation. And even in my own city of Dunwoody, there were on the exit and on-ramps of the freeway were these signs that says boycott China. If you want to take it from a business perspective, you would put it at the Chinese embassy or maybe at Walmart, someone who's doing business with China. Right. But you're putting it in front of residential areas. You're sending a message to the Chinese who live in Dunwoody when you do that. And so I knew something like this was coming. I didn't know it was going to result in the death of 6 people. But from what was happening in San Francisco and New York, we knew the violence was coming. Just didn't expect it to be a shooting like this.
Do you feel that this is a special moment in time? I mean, Trump hasn't helped over the past year. And if anything, he stoked the fire even worse.
Yeah, and I want to talk about how he stoked the fire as early as 2017 when he started challenging North Korea and all the talk of fire and brimstone. Unfortunately, we are considered perpetual foreigners. And so, when people hear that, they just see the Korean Americans living in this country, even if they're second generation, their parents were born here as foreigners. And when Trump goes fire and brimstone to these people, they think, all right, this is my permission to go attack and harass. And then, comes the pandemic and someone's got to be scapegoated, and he wanted to scapegoat. Not just he says it's the Chinese government. What a lot of Americans hear is Chinese people. And so they take out their frustration and anger on Chinese people.
Do you find that Asian American is a broad term, right? My heritage is Italian, right? So people, when I grew up in the 80s, college in the 70s, I was Italian American. I belonged to the Italian American Society, college. I mean, that's a bit more finite. Although if you speak to an Italian, a Sicilian is different from a Roman, that's different from a Milanese or someone from Milan. So, that's all within that group. But Asian American is so broad, right? It takes in a variety of countries, dozens of countries, really. Do you think that's, does that help? Does that also provide a coalition, if you will? What does that do for you?
So the term Asian American gives influence by providing the numbers that are needed. If you were to just look at the economic impact of just the Cambodian or Vietnamese community, it's not as high as an economic impact from the Asian American community. And so for the stakes of certain communities in other states where they're just small, they number in the hundreds, say Columbus, Ohio, where Cambodians may only have 200 and Vietnamese may only have 1,000, but then you add in Chinese and Indian, then we're 10, 15,000. We become 5% of the population. We have now a voice. And so it's important to have that designation so that we get the resources we need.
Let me just point out something from the Pew Research that many people may not be aware of, but it also shows the strength and I think the growth of the Asian community. That Asian communities are the fastest racial and ethnic group in the U.S. electorate. So among the voters, that's the fastest growing population. Most of them are naturalized citizens. That's 76% of them are immigrants and 37% are U.S. born. That's normally not the case. Usually the fastest growing part or the largest part would be U.S. born. But we're talking about immigrants that have come here that have decided to naturalize, to become U.S. citizens. They chose to become U.S. citizens, become part of this country, and to take up that responsibility of voting as well. So you have that happening. You have the growth of a lot of minority areas. You have the areas where, especially in, let's say, places like Duluth and parts of Atlanta, where there's a growing population of Asian Americans and where there are people deciding they need to leave for some reason. What they're calling ethnoburbs becomes a white flight area and people are moving out to other counties. Do you think, obviously some people feel threatened for some reason. How do we address that? What's your thoughts on that?
It's complicated. Historically, the reasons why Chinatowns exist is because at one point in time in our country's history is that we could group people into sections. And so we could say, all the Chinese are going to live in this area and it becomes Chinatown. But in the case of Duluth, Pleasant Hill area, it was more just free market capitalism. The more Koreans started to move into the area, the more businesses came in to support that population, whether it's grocery stores or restaurants. And so, nothing's monotonous. Nothing is like this problem applies in all situations. So when you look at Gwinnett and you look at that area, the schools become a bit more competitive, maybe too competitive. So people feel like, all right, I need to move somewhere where maybe my kid will have more of a shot. And that could be a reason for the white flight.
And I think that has to deal a little bit with what was happening when AJC article pointed out about school rankings, right? Mm-hmm. That the top 18 of the top 20 kids in, let's say, Duluth high schools were Asian. And colleges pick, or used to pick, I don't know if they still pick, or take into consideration rankings as well. So I think the county or the school system decided to do away with rankings because of that, which is crazy to me because, it's almost like dumbing things down for no reason. Instead of raising the bar, we are dumbing things down because other people may be smarter. It's just like, you need to get your kids working a little better, maybe. But
yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
No. That's a very real, and it's actually a problem because as much as our society likes to reward competition, free market, and I am, as a small business owner, I truly believe in it. When a certain group seems to attain too much success, then people get concerned and then they find ways to change things so that it becomes advantageous to them. So we look at some of the Ivy League schools and all of a sudden you realize that Asian Americans actually have to have a higher GPA than all of the other ethnic groups to make it into those schools. So Harvard, an Asian American has to have a 4.1 or 4.2 to get in, but a white student would only need a 3.8 or 3.9. And they would say, well, this student does this and that. And so that gives them the jump over. And so the true flat out merit, those rules never truly stay in place. They're always shifting that bar.
It's a moving target. It's like, okay, your grades aren't good enough, but you've done a lot of volunteer work in the community. So we're going to use that. There's nothing really wrong with that. But the problem is that these pendulums keep swinging back and forth, right? Like you said, when things get when people feel too threatened or such, there's always someone that has to be a scapegoat, it seems. It's funny in a way. It reminds me of there was a Soprano episode where one of the characters walk around with his cell phone talking. He's walking around Little Italy, and he barely walked 2 blocks, and he's like, "I'm in Chinatown already." That just shows the expansion of a population that is just one of many ethnic groups, right?
Right.
To be doing that successful and providing good. I mean, we're already seeing movies like Parasite. A lot of Asian influence in our communities, in food, in music, in other areas in entertainment. And, maybe people are looking at that and instead of embracing it. I love Asian food. I love sushi. I mean, Italian food. Grew up on matzo balls. We always talked about matzo balls and meatballs being interchangeable almost in the neighborhood I grew up in. So instead of seeing that as a good thing, there are too many people, I think, that just not happy with themselves maybe and are being threatened. What do you think? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, so there's Asian Americans like myself who we live in two worlds. I am perfectly fine going down to the Kroger right down the street from me, and I'm comfortable, and I can go to the H Mart also down the street from me and be perfectly comfortable. But there are those who go into Kroger and they feel like everyone's staring at them. And then, of course, there are those who go into H Mart and feel like everyone is staring at them. We need to get to a point where it's okay for you to go into an H Mart and go get groceries. It's no different than going into a Kroger. And then we won't see that kind of white flight that happens.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I mean, I go into H Mart because, quite frankly, I like the vegetables more than I like, and it's better priced than like other supermarkets. So I think what happens, just like, on the face of it, if you will, we all look a bit different, right? And even Anglo-Saxon Asians, if you will, blended families, which is if you look at the younger generation, is more and more happening. So we're looking. I think society is looking at one group that really is changing quite a bit. Your parents versus you versus your children maybe are changing. We're all becoming, it really is becoming what I always never thought was really a melting pot growing up in New York, but really is becoming more of a melting pot now, I think.
It is. My family is a perfect example of that, where my parents are both Vietnamese, but I didn't marry Vietnamese. I actually married a Chinese woman. My brother, the other two aren't married, but my brother that got married, he married white. And so the blending is happening. You can't avoid it. Love takes you where it takes you, which is a good thing. Yeah. I think that's something that needs to be embraced. It's sad that there are some who would look at that and go, a child that's half Asian and half white has no place in our society. That's such an outdated idea that I really hope that we get away from that.
I think if you look at college kids or high school kids in an area that is a bit more diverse, you find a broad range of friendships, and it is changing, and it's a good thing that it's changing. How do you think all this has affected Asian businesses, Asian-owned businesses in Peachtree Corners or in our area? Has it affected them?
It has definitely affected. I wasn't the only one who opened up right before the pandemic. There's a place called Mr. PJ's right down the street from me, owned by a Korean man. Great chicken wings. But he was getting scared too because he saw business drop right away when March hit and the first cases in Georgia started to be announced. he saw a big drop. I saw a drop, but not as significant as many other businesses. There's kind of an insulation barrier or cushion for Peachy Corners, I think, in that Peachy Corners has become a place for a lot of Asian families, Asian Indian, Korean Americans, Vietnamese American families have started to move into the area. And so they continue to go to those businesses. And, I'd like to think that they kind of like in Dunwoody, encourage neighbors to go to other businesses. I saw that on the forums in Dunwoody where, we got to protect these businesses. And then every once in a while, someone will go, don't forget about this restaurant. They need help too. And so I think the more diverse community you have where your kids are in school together and some of those kids' parents are business owners in the city you live in, you're like, hey, we got to help this family too.
Yeah.
And so I think Peachtree Corners has been lucky in that regards. I think we've got a great city, great neighbors who live around here. And so hopefully we won't see any of the harassment and definitely, hopefully we won't see any of the violence that we've seen in other parts of Atlanta.
It's doubtful, I think, in my mind. Hopefully I'm not saying the wrong thing. But I think it's doubtful in this area because I just think this area is a bit different. The makeup of the area, the diversity of the area, the income, the economic prosperity of the area has been able to survive through things, right?
Yep.
So people are still buying food. They're still going out. Even before sort of the lifting of the stuff, people were Instacarting. I mean, I was using Instacart to get food and ordering and curbside pickups. And, the takeout really didn't stop too much. And so we were still, patronizing businesses. One of the things that we talked about was, young kids being bullied and stuff. What can Asian families do maybe to address some of that, in schools? What, for practical purposes, can they do?
I would like to see parents start to address the bullying in a way that's bridge building, has a connection with the school. Far too often when Asian American kids get bullied, parents tell them, just put your head low, study hard, get through school, get to college, you'll be okay. It's not okay. I saw it with kids who came to college when I was in college that really struggled integrating because that scar, that fear you get from bullying stays with you and it hurts how you interact with other people. So I want the parents to talk to their kids and tell their kids, if you're being bullied, you need to tell us and we'll bring it up to the school and, really impart to the principal and the school counselors that it needs to be addressed, that this has gone on for far too long. Just because you have successful academic Asian American students at your school doesn't mean there aren't other kids where the bullying is affecting their ability to learn. And so the parents need to be more vocal and build a relationship with their school administrators.
Have you heard of any bullying or anything along those lines?
I have. I'm not going to call out any schools, but I have heard of the bullying happening it seems to start in the middle school and then will carry over somewhat to the high schools. And so it's unfortunate that it does happen, but I think we'll be able to figure out a way. Some of these Asian American advocacy groups, because of the shooting, I think they're going to start to address the bullying from a possible racial perspective now. And see if any of that, clearly some of it has to come from race issues, but to address it properly in the middle school and high school grades.
For sure. I mean, kids can be traumatized easily in some ways. Some ways, depending on the kid. I mean, it might toughen them up. It might other kids, toughen them up. A ridiculous thing to expect from a child, that they should be toughened up. We used to hear stuff about our kids need safe spaces. And I always joked around about, what does that mean? Growing up, we didn't have safe spaces. Is that an old thing to say? I think that kids should be challenged with their thoughts and beliefs, but not challenged because of who they are. You should always be able to defend your ideas, because that just makes you better, I think, and validates you better, and actually makes you a better person if you can defend why you believe something a certain way. But bullying is not part of that. That's just a total different thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've lived here in Dunwoody for 10 years, I guess, in the South. And you originally came from
Ohio.
Ohio was a bit different for you, the North than the South?
Yeah, it's very different. We have an area of Ohio called Youngstown, and there's a lot of Italian Americans who, it sounds weird, but they retired to Youngstown. They retired to Youngstown from Chicago and New York. And so, but yeah, Ohio is definitely a Midwestern town or state where everyone's friendly. The communities tend to be very blue collar, much smaller. And so there's a more intimate connection among neighbors, because when one neighbor does something, it spreads across the city very quickly, because the city I grew up in, we had 7 GM factories. And so everyone worked for GM. So, if you did something strange, the word spread through the unions across 7 factories very quickly.
And I come from New York and Brooklyn, and I guess that my parents and everyone that I knew retired to Jersey across the way. But I don't know about you, but when I moved down, I found the South very different than the North by far. In a way, I found it friendlier. I got to know more people, but you also find things, neighbors yelling across the street, "I just saw The Godfather." But how did you find the South when you came down?
I found it very similar to what you said. I definitely saw the Southern hospitality. Everyone's very friendly, but some people, I think it's kind of like that saying that people like to laugh at, the "bless your heart" saying. There's a goodness to it, but there's also a slight backhand to it. And so, some people will go, "Oh, your English is very good." And it's like, well, do you say that to like everyone you meet? Like someone that you think is probably a foreigner, even though I'm not. I was born and raised in Ohio. So that happens. And then, it's always tough. You get asked, "Where are you from?" And my first response is always, "I'm from Ohio." I know what people mean. And so to figure out when someone is saying that from more or less an ignorant perspective versus a curious perspective, it's always difficult.
It's a better way of saying, I like asking people, what's your heritage? You're American. I'm American. All Americans do, right?
Yep.
But where did your ancestors come from? Where your parents come from?
Yep.
And talking to you, I found out, and I didn't realize this, I was born here in America. So I always thought I was first generation American. But you put me straight, because you said the federal government doesn't look at it that way, right?
No. They see the immigrants and your immigrant parents as the first generation. They're the first to become American, so they're first generation.
If they're naturalized. So of course my son says, what if you were born here first and your parents become naturalized later? Are they second generation? Great question.
It's a great question. I think they're still considered first generation. So that would apply to me. I was born 6 months after my parents got here. And so they weren't citizens yet, but I was definitely a citizen the moment I said hi to everyone. But I think the parents would still be considered first generation.
I thought so too. But I thought that was good. He's always out there with a different question than I had in mind. So getting back to the real question at hand that we've been covering also, what do you think local businesses can do to help out?
I think local businesses need to just be a little bit more aware. You don't have to necessarily be proactive, but pay attention to your customers who come in. If you're not an Asian American owned business and you see someone come in and something happens, and it may be something very small, and it could be something that's a big conflict. And so I'm going to talk about a few things to address as a bystander, because it also applies if you're a business owner and you're there watching. You can always get involved by what everyone seems to do nowadays is documenting. You can tape it, so you make sure your security cameras are on or your phone. Right. But you can also help to try to diffuse the situation by delaying something or distracting them, like, hey, you want to try this or you want to try that, depending on what your business is. That will help your customers feel more comfortable. If you feel like your Asian American customers are a little bit nervous coming in, then get to know those customers. Have your staff get to know them. I do my best. I don't necessarily know every single one of my customers' names, but I think that's helped our business quite a bit, that when you come in, if you've come in at least 3 times, one of the staff or myself, we're going to know your name. And we can tell if you're nervous or some people are just nervous in general. And then some may walk in and see that it's, one day my main room is filled with old white guys that are about to go golf, and it makes some people uncomfortable. And so you got to engage with them. For the Asian businesses, they need to let our law enforcement, let our city officials know if something's happening. If you talk to the businesses on Buford Highway, Canton House, some of these businesses that have been around for decades, they'll tell you they've had rocks thrown through their windows. They've had their harassing phone calls. Businesses in Peachy Corners, Dunwoody, in this northern DeKalb area, Gwinnett, southern Gwinnett, got to speak up. You got to let us know. If we don't know, Gwinnett Police can't run additional patrols.
Right.
My shopping center is a perfect example. You would never know it, but it's a very mixed culturally shopping center. Next door to me is a Thai restaurant owned by a Thai family. Across from me is a dry cleaner owned by a Filipino family. And then I've got a Chinese family with a vegan restaurant and a Persian restaurant as well. And so it's a very, very diverse little shopping center we have. And I've talked to all of them that if something happens, if you see something that is, even if it's questionable, if you don't want to call the police, let me know. I'll call Gwinnett Police. I'll let our city council know, just so that the awareness is there. And when the awareness is there, it helps to lower the tension.
Do you think there's enough laws out there? Do you think the hate crimes bill that Kemp signed into law, I think last summer, do you think all that's enough? Do you think it's necessary to make sure that the hate crimes bill is used, so then it's not just a crime, but it's noted as a hate crime? Do you think that's important?
I think it's very important. And it's not just like signing the bill and saying, we've got this hate crime bill. Mm-hmm. We have to educate the public that there is a hate crime bill, and your act of violence, whether it's throwing a rock at someone or shooting and killing someone, comes with larger penalties if it turns out to be based on race, on gender, on religion, all the categories that the bill covered. But the bill alone isn't the solution. It just provides a buffer, hopefully making people think twice before acting. We really need to get to the root cause of why people feel like they need to blame specific subgroups, whether it's based on race, Black or Asian, Latino, based on gender, blame things on women, or, sexuality, the LGBTQ. You can't outlaw that kind of bias, but you can come up with policies and programs that will help educate people and hopefully get them to cross that bias. And I think some of it we need to start accepting is mental illness and start providing the funding to address mental illness.
They're all good points. The bill is one thing, and it's a political tool. So if it's not enacted, and culture is something else, right? You can't put your foot on someone's neck or your knee, if you will, if you can't culturally understand why things are happening. Right. So we've been talking to Long Tran here, owner of Peachy Corners Cafe here in Peachy Corners. about Asian hate crimes. It's a tough issue to talk about. We did a series of these types of things, this type of podcast about the crime on blacks back during this past summer. Do you find any hope coming? Where do you find hope coming from?
I find hope from the younger generation. When we did our rally, these nursing students, they wanted to make sure that we were inviting all the other communities with us. When George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery happened, I went to some of those protests and rallies and spoke to Black community leaders. And I saw the younger generation show up of all backgrounds, Latino, Asian, white. They all were showing up. They were marching together. And so I think the younger generation does not have a tolerance for this, and they call it out. If you're on TikTok, you'll see it called out on TikTok all the time. On certain social media, people say, it's not cool to hate or to be a bigot. This is why, and they post pictures and videos. So I see hope from the younger generation that they've drawn a line that this isn't going to happen anymore. I'm Generation X, and I think we got lulled into a perspective of it came to an end. It didn't really happen. It's all isolated incidences. And, when white supremacy was given a voice and some influence and power, we saw what they could do. I mean, never in my lifetime did I see something like Charlottesville. And we were lulled into thinking that could never happen. And so my generation didn't fight. But this younger generation, they've got the tools and they're talking to one another.
For sure. Thank God. Because really,
yes.
There's just too much stuff going on. The riots and the Washington, the takeover of DC at one point, almost apocalyptic looking. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, the people are okay with that happening and justifying those things. It's been great having you on. It's been great talking to you. I got to come over to have some cup of coffee and dessert later, maybe.
Absolutely. And if you've never had bubble tea, you got to try our bubble tea as well.
I haven't had it, and my kids go out to get it, so I think
okay.
To try some of it. So I appreciate you coming on, Long. Thank you for being with me. Hang in there. Honor. Yeah, hang in there after this. But you know what? Before we leave, tell everyone where you're located and how they can find out information about you, your business, and anything else that you'd like to tell them to reach.
Sure. So we're Peachy Corners Cafe. It's actually Peachy, Peachy. I don't know, it was a smart decision to go with Peachy versus Peach Tree, but that's what we went with. We're located by Holcomb Bridge and Spalding Drive. So if you know where Loving Hut is, Loving Hut's been here forever, or Royal Thai, who's been here forever. We're right in between the two. We're not in the same shopping center as the bowling alley. We're in the one next to them. We're open from 8 to 8 every day but Sunday. We're open on Sundays too, but from 10 to 6. Come on down. We have great coffee, great bubble tea. We also have wine if you want to just chill out in the evenings, to wine and a dessert. And then if you want to get involved with addressing the violence against Asian Americans somehow. As a community, one of our first efforts right now is to fundraise for the families. They need money for legal fees and to help with the kids who are now parentless. So you can go to any of the community advocacy groups, Asian American Advancing Justice, or the Center for Pan-Asian American, the CPAC. So Center for Pan-Asian American Community Services is what it's called. And you can go to their websites and find a donation link and donate there. And for Peachy Corners, you can go to www.peachycornerscafe.com, and that will get you to our Facebook, and you'll see our calendar and a link to everything else that we're a part of.
Excellent. We'll have most of these links, if not all of them, in our show notes, so check that out later. But thank you again, Long. I appreciate you being with me and talking today.
Thank you, Rico, for having me. This was a great conversation.
Yes, same here.
Thanks for listening to Peachtree Corners Life with Rico Figliolini. You can listen to our live stream on Spreaker every Thursday night at 8:30 p.m. or on demand at iHeartRadio, Spotify, and iTunes. Don't forget to like our Facebook page for notification of our live video streams of the show. Catch our other podcast shows at PeachtreeCornersLife.com.